You're going to transfer the inheritance to my name, Madison. That's the only way we can secure our future, Mike demanded, his voice cold and sharp. My heart raced as I cradled my 8-month pregnant belly, shaking my head. No, I can't do that. It's my family's legacy, I whispered. Before I could process what was happening, Mike's hands shoved me hard from behind. I lost my balance and fell forward, crashing onto the floor, pain exploding in my stomach as darkness enveloped me. My name is Madison, and I'm 29 years old. Until recently, I believed my life was ordinary. That perception shattered a few months ago when my father passed away suddenly, leaving behind something I never expected. A massive inheritance worth over $50 million. He had quietly built a fortune through real estate and various businesses, and now all of that was entrusted to me. At first, I struggled to handle such a colossal responsibility. My husband, Mike, seemed supportive initially, but soon, things took a darker turn. As soon as Mike learned the full value of the inheritance, his behavior shifted. What once felt like a loving marriage transformed into a battleground fueled by greed. Mike began pressuring me, constantly asking me to transfer the inheritance to his name. I initially dismissed his requests as mere excitement, but over time, his obsession escalated. Our arguments grew more frequent, with Mike insisting that we needed to take control of the money to secure our future. I didn't realize how far he would go to claim it, until that moment when he pushed me. I never imagined the man I married would care more about money than his own family. As time passed, it became clear that Mike's love for me had been overshadowed by his greed for the inheritance I received after my father's death. When my father passed, I was devastated. Losing him was the hardest thing I had ever faced. In the midst of my grief, I learned about the wealth he had left behind, over $50 million in real estate, businesses, and investments. It wasn't just money. It was his life's work, his legacy. I hesitated to think about it at first, but Mike's fixation on it was relentless. We could do so much with that kind of money, Madison. We need to act fast before anyone else gets involved, he would say, his eyes gleaming with a hunger that frightened me. I tried to brush off his comments, assuming it was just excitement. But soon, it became evident that Mike wasn't thinking of us as a family. He was consumed by what he could control. Every day, he brought up the inheritance. You need to transfer it to my name. It's safer that way, he insisted. I refused each time. It's my father's legacy, Mike. I can't just hand it over, I replied, my voice trembling with the weight of yet another argument. His frustration grew with every no, and the man I once knew, the one who had cared for me and our unborn child, was fading before my eyes. In his place stood a stranger. One night, as we prepared for bed, the tension reached a breaking point. Mike had been distant all evening, his eyes cold and his voice clipped. I could feel the storm brewing. Madison, he said suddenly, standing in front of me, you have no idea what you're doing. If you don't transfer that inheritance to me, you're going to regret it. Stunned, I responded, this money isn't yours to control, Mike. I won't do it. His face twisted in anger, and before I could react, he lunged at me. His hands shoved me hard from behind, and I felt myself falling forward. The pain was instant and searing as I hit the ground, my belly taking the full impact. I could hear Mike shouting, but his voice faded as darkness consumed me. When I opened my eyes, the world around me was hazy. Pain radiated from my belly, and I could barely move. I tried to sit up, but my body felt too heavy and weak. My mind raced. What had happened? And then it all came back to me. Mike's shove, the hard fall, the impact on my pregnant stomach. Panic washed over me. I placed my hand on my belly, desperately trying to feel any sign of movement. Relief flooded through me when I finally sensed a faint kick. The baby was still there, still fighting, but I knew something wasn't right. I needed help. Through my blurred vision, I could make out Mike pacing across the room, muttering to himself. He looked more like a stranger than the man I once loved. There was no concern in his expression, no hint of worry for me or the baby. It was as if he couldn't see the damage he had done. "Mike," I croaked, my voice barely a whisper. He stopped and looked at me, but there was no softness in his gaze. "You'll thank me later," he said coldly, as if the violence was justified, as if his greed had given him the right to hurt me. Struggling to my feet, I realized Mike wouldn't help. I was on my own. Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I managed to stand, clutching my belly for support. "I'm going to the hospital," I declared weakly, not waiting for his response. The ride felt like an eternity, the pain increasing with every passing second. All I could think about was my baby. Would they survive? Was this nightmare going to end with me losing the one thing that still mattered to me? Once I arrived at the hospital, the staff immediately rushed me to the maternity ward. Doctors ran tests, checking both me and the baby while I lay there, barely holding on. I could hear their voices, some urgent, some calm, but none of the words registered in my mind. I was too afraid of what they might say. Finally, a doctor approached me. His face was serious, but there was a glimmer of reassurance in his eyes. "You and the baby are stable, but we'll need to monitor you closely," he said. Relief washed over me, though fear still lingered. I was safe for now, but I knew this wasn't over. Lying in that hospital bed, I had time to think about everything: the betrayal, the violence, the coldness in Mike's eyes. The man I had once trusted was gone, replaced by someone driven by greed and obsession. As painful as it was to admit, I knew I couldn't stay with him anymore. For my sake, and for my child's, I had to walk away. I spent the next few days recovering, my thoughts consumed by what had happened. I hadn't spoken to Mike since the fall, and I wasn't sure if I ever wanted to. All I knew was that my father's inheritance had brought out the worst in him, revealing a side I could never forgive. As I left the hospital, I made a decision. I wasn't going back to that house, to that man. I would protect my baby and fight to ensure Mike never got his hands on the money he so desperately craved. The life I thought I had was gone, shattered by one moment of violence, but I was still here, my baby was still here, and we were going to be okay. Back at my parents' house, I found comfort and safety I hadn't felt in a long time. My mother doted on me, helping me settle into my old bedroom, while my father was a quiet presence, always nearby in case I needed anything. I couldn't bring myself to tell them the full extent of what had happened. They knew about the inheritance, of course, but I left out the details of Mike's rage and the fall. I wasn't ready to face that part yet, not even with them. Days turned into weeks, and as I approached my due date, I realized I hadn't heard from Mike. Not a single call or message. Part of me was relieved. The other part wondered if he was planning something, if he was plotting another way to get his hands on the money. His silence felt ominous, like the calm before a storm. I wasn't naive enough to think he would just walk away. Mike wasn't the kind of man to give up easily, especially when there were millions of dollars at stake. I had to prepare for what might come next. I spoke with a lawyer, explaining the situation as best as I could. The inheritance was legally mine, passed directly from my father to me, but I needed to ensure Mike couldn't try to claim any of it, especially since we were still married. The lawyer was reassuring, telling me that Mike had no legal claim to the money, but the conversation left me feeling uneasy. I had seen what Mike was capable of. His greed had turned him into someone I no longer recognized, and I couldn't predict what he might do next. A week before my due date, the doorbell rang at my parents' house. I had been resting, trying to stay calm in those final days before the baby arrived, but the sound jolted me awake. My mother answered the door, and I could hear her talking to someone in a low, concerned voice. Then I heard his voice. "Madison," Mike called from the hallway. My heart sank. I knew this moment was coming, but I wasn't ready to face him. I didn't know what he would say or how far he would go to get what he wanted. Taking a deep breath, I stood up and made my way to the living room. There he was, standing in the doorway, looking every bit the man I used to know, but with a hardness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice unusually calm. I nodded, though every instinct in me screamed to stay away from him. We sat down, the silence between us thick with tension. "I've been thinking," Mike began, his hands clasped in front of him. "I know things got out of control. I know I hurt you, but we can still fix this. We can be a family, Madison. I'll take care of you and the baby. We just need to work together." I stared at him, feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. "You pushed me, Mike. You hurt me, and you didn't care. All you cared about was the money." His face hardened. "I made a mistake, but I was thinking about our future. That money could change everything for us. You can't just throw it away." "It's not yours, Mike. It was never yours," I said firmly. "And I'm not going to let you control me or the baby. We're done." For a moment, I thought he might argue, might push again, but something in my voice must have reached him. His expression shifted, and he stood up slowly, his eyes cold. "If that's how you want it, Madison, fine. But don't think this is over. I'll get what's mine." With that, he turned and left, leaving me sitting there, my heart racing. I knew this wasn't the end, but I also recognized that I was stronger than I had ever been before. For my baby, I would fight. I would protect what was mine. In the days following Mike's visit, I could feel the tension building. His parting words echoed in my mind, and I knew he wasn't going to let go easily. But I also knew I had to stay focused on what mattered most, my baby. The due date was fast approaching, and I couldn't afford to be distracted by Mike's threats. I kept my parents informed, though I still didn't tell them everything. My father, with his quiet strength, reassured me that I wasn't alone in this. He sensed I was facing more than just the challenges of pregnancy, and though he didn't press me for details, his protective nature was palpable. My mother, ever the caretaker, was by my side constantly, helping me prepare for the baby, making sure I was as comfortable as possible. Then it happened. Late one night, just a few days before my due date, the contractions started. At first, they were manageable, a dull ache in my lower back. But soon, they intensified, each wave of pain pulling me deeper into the reality of labor. I called out for my mother, and within minutes, my parents were by my side, helping me into the car and rushing me to the hospital. Everything became a blur, the bright hospital lights, the nurse's calm but urgent instructions, the sound of my own breathing as I fought through each contraction. Despite the physical pain, my mind kept returning to one thought. I needed to protect my baby. Mike's obsession with the inheritance, his dangerous actions, all of it faded into the background as I focused on bringing my child into the world safely. Hours passed, and after what felt like an eternity, I finally heard the cry I had been waiting for. My baby was here, alive and healthy. Tears streamed down my face as the nurse placed the tiny bundle in my arms. In that moment, everything else disappeared. It was just me and my baby, a new life beginning. But even in that moment of pure joy, I knew this wasn't over. Mike was still out there, still consumed by his greed. And now I had someone else to protect, not just myself, but my child. I would do whatever it took to keep us safe. A few days later, after being discharged from the hospital, I returned to my parents' house with my newborn in my arms. The house felt different now, filled with the quiet sounds of my baby's breaths and the gentle warmth of family. But there was an underlying sense of tension, like we were all waiting for something to happen. And then it did. One afternoon, as I was rocking my baby to sleep, I received a phone call from my lawyer. "Madison," she said, her tone serious, "I've been informed that Mike has filed a claim to contest your inheritance." My heart sank. "What do you mean?" "He's arguing that, as your husband, he's entitled to a share of your inheritance. He's trying to prove that the money should be part of the marital assets." A cold wave of fear washed over me. Mike wasn't going to stop. He was determined to take what didn't belong to him, and now he was using the legal system to do it. but I wasn't going to let him win. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice shaking. "We fight," the lawyer said confidently. "I've already started gathering evidence, and we'll show the court that the inheritance is legally yours, but it's going to be a battle." I hung up the phone, staring down at my baby, who was still peacefully asleep in my arms. The storm was coming, and I knew that Mike would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. But I wasn't the same person I had been when all this started. I was stronger now, and I had something far more important than money to fight for. The days following the call from my lawyer felt like a race against time. Every moment was filled with a mixture of love for my newborn and the looming dread of what Mike was trying to do. He had filed his claim, trying to stake his place in the inheritance, something that was never his to begin with. But I wasn't about to let him take control of my life or my child's future without a fight. With my lawyer working diligently to prepare our case, I spent as much time as I could focusing on my baby. The peaceful moments when I cradled her in my arms or watched her sleep were the only times I felt truly at ease. She was the reason I was determined to push forward, to face whatever Mike had planned, no matter how ugly it got. A week passed, and then another. The legal process was slow, frustratingly slow, but I tried to remain patient. My lawyer reassured me that Mike's claim didn't have a strong foundation. After all, the inheritance had come directly to me after my father's passing, and Mike had no legal right to it. But Mike was persistent, using every possible loophole to challenge me and make me feel like this wasn't going to end. One afternoon, as I sat in the living room with my mother, discussing the next steps for the legal case, the doorbell rang. A sudden wave of anxiety washed over me. My mother went to answer it, and I could hear the muffled voices from the hallway. Then my heart froze. Mike's voice cut through the air like a knife. "I'm here to see Madison. We need to talk," he demanded. I stood up, my legs shaking slightly, but I didn't back down. I walked to the front door, where Mike stood, his eyes dark with the same cold determination I had seen before. "What are you doing here, Mike? You know you shouldn't be here," I said, my voice steady despite the fear twisting in my stomach. He crossed his arms, staring at me with a condescending smirk. "You're making this harder than it needs to be, Madison. I'm just here to talk, to make you see reason. If you would just sign over part of the inheritance, we could move on from this. We could even raise the baby together." My blood boiled at his words. The nerve he had, standing there in front of me, acting as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't shoved me to the ground and endangered both me and our child. He was delusional if he thought I would ever trust him again, let alone give him control of my family's fortune. "No, Mike," I said firmly, "I'm not signing anything. You have no right to the inheritance, and you know that. This isn't about us. This is about you and your greed." His smirk faltered, replaced by a flash of anger. "You think you're better than me? You think you can just shut me out like this? I'm doing what I need to do to protect myself and our child. I'm not going to let you manipulate or control me anymore. So if you're done, you need to leave," I said, my voice shaking slightly, but my resolve was strong. For a moment, he just stood there, his face contorting as he tried to hold back his rage. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and stormed off. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving me standing there, trembling. As I returned to the living room, my mother was already on the phone with my lawyer, explaining what had just happened. "We need to get a restraining order," she said firmly, her voice steady in contrast to the storm of emotions swirling inside me. That night, I lay awake, my baby sleeping soundly beside me. I couldn't stop thinking about Mike's words, his threats. He wasn't going to stop until he got what he wanted. But I had made my decision. I was going to fight, not just for the inheritance, but for my child and our future. The next morning, we started the process of filing for a restraining order. My lawyer assured me it was the right move, given Mike's behavior and the growing tension between us. It was another layer of protection, something I desperately needed as this legal battle continued. As the days turned into weeks, something unexpected happened. Mike's claims began to unravel. My lawyer found evidence that Mike had been involved in some shady dealings at work, fraudulent transactions, and suspicious activities that were now coming to light. His reputation was crumbling, and it was clear that he was trying to secure the inheritance because he knew he was losing everything else. The court sided with me. Mike had no legal claim to the inheritance, and his attempts to seize control of it were shut down. It was over. The day the final ruling came through, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The battle had been long and painful, but I had won. More importantly, I had protected my baby, my family, and my father's legacy. Standing in my parents' home, with my daughter in my arms, I realized that I was finally free. Free from Mike's manipulation, his greed, and his control. And as I looked down at my baby's peaceful face, I knew that the future was ours. With the court ruling in my favor, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. However, the journey was far from over. My lawyer informed me that, due to the evidence gathered against Mike regarding his fraudulent activities at work, he faced serious legal consequences. As Mike's reputation crumbled, charges were brought against him for fraud, leading to a formal investigation. It wasn't long before he was arrested and taken into custody, his once prominent career shattered. The news of his arrest was a harsh reminder of the man he had become, driven by greed and obsession. At his sentencing hearing, I chose to attend. I wanted to see justice served, not just for myself, but for all the pain he had caused. The judge laid out the evidence clearly. Mike was sentenced to 3 years in prison for his crimes, along with restitution for his victims. I felt a sense of closure as the gavel struck, signaling the end of his reign of manipulation over my life. Walking out of the courthouse, I took a deep breath, feeling lighter than I had in months. I had fought hard for my child and myself, and I was finally free from the shadows of my past. With my baby in my arms, I knew that we had a bright future ahead.